In the rest of the presentation, we'll be turning to the future, thinking about climate change as a challenge of managing risks, looking at the risks in particular, and thinking about the implications for responses. So I'd like to start with a few defining features of climate change. First is its scope. Climate change affects most people in most places. And second might be its complexity. Climate change involves potentially big consequences playing out over pretty long time frames, from years to millennia. It involves potential for learning over time. It involves really persistent uncertainties about exactly how the climate will change, and importantly, in thinking about impacts about how society will change 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 100 years from now. And if you think about what the world was like 20 years ago, you see that that's a really big challenge. Putting all these things together, we know that it's unlikely that we'll ever be able to say for a specific location at a specific time exactly what the impacts will be. So as Chris started out, climate change is really a challenge in managing risks. It's about making decisions in a changing world with various uncertainties persisting. And in this, time frame is important. Here's that map of the world that Mike started with, showing that warming to date has been about a little under 1 degree Celsius, or 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And this map helps put into context what we might see in the coming century. Before I describe what you see on the screen, I'd like to acknowledge Professor Noah Diffenbaugh and his colleagues who developed it. And as a testament to the intensity of the assessment process, if you added up all the hours Noah spent on this graph, it's basically several months of his life is right here, including work from remote locations and in the middle of the night. So what we see in this little jaggy black line, that's the warming to date, showing global mean temperature increase here. The red plume there shows a potential scenario of continued high emissions and what the warming could be through the coming century. And in blue, you see a scenario of ambitious mitigation and what the warming might be. The bottom maps show the world out at the end of the century for ambitious mitigation versus continued high emissions. And those timeframes are really able to be seen in the top plot here. So over the next few decades, there is a lot of warming that is essentially baked into the system due to emissions to date, but importantly, due to all that infrastructure that's currently churning away. In terms of real-time reduction of risk over this time frame, it comes down to societal responses and adaptation. There's responsibility in that we have to reckon with the warming that is baked into the system. But there's also a lot of responsibility in that mitigation choices over these next few decades will be profoundly important in determining our climate options in the long term. So the Working Group 3 report out this week showed that to maximize the likelihood of staying on that blue trajectory and to decrease the cost of that trajectory, it's important that ambitious mitigation occur in the next few decades. So the assessment throughout Working Group 2 considers the whole coming century and beyond, really thinking about these timeframes in the assessment. And embracing those fundamental features of the climate change challenge, one of the main findings is that responding effectively to climate change really benefits from iteratively managing risks. So that top box there shows the importance of assessing the widest possible range of outcomes, including things that might not be all that likely, but would carry really big consequences if they happened. The blue box down to the right shows that once you've assessed all the potential outcomes, you can use that to understand the benefits and trade-offs of different response options. And finally, as those options become actions, monitoring and learning over time is really important. So what are the risks? The report concludes most fundamentally that increasing magnitudes of climate change increase the likelihood of severe and pervasive impacts. There are key risks associated with food insecurity, water scarcity, biodiversity loss, risks from extremes like heat and flooding. And some of these would carry irreversible consequences in terms of biodiversity loss or large magnitudes of sea level rise from ice sheet loss. Many of the risks go up with continued high emissions, but the flip side of that is that limiting the rate and magnitude of climate change reduces risks. Especially ambitious mitigation in the near term can play a profound role in reducing risks in the second half of the 21st century. In the next 3 slides, I'd like to take a deep dive into some of the data supporting the assessment. So biodiversity risks. The report found that a large fraction of species face increased risks of extinction as climate change interacts with other stressors. And for natural ecosystems, the rate of climate change is particularly important. So what this shows is for 8 different categories of plants and animals, how fast can they move? And these long gray bars indicate how fast they can move, the ranges for those species categories, and the blue is their median speed. But then how fast is the climate changing, and how fast are temperatures moving across landscapes? These somewhat cryptic notations down here indicate climate velocities, that rate at which temperature is moving across landscapes for ambitious mitigation over here as compared to continued emissions over here. And what this really shows is that if a given gray bar is to the left of one of these dotted lines, those species will have a hard time tracking the climate as it changes. And if you can't track the climate change, you either adapt, you become less abundant, or you go locally or globally extinct. This graphic really hones in on risks for fisheries in the oceans. And what it shows is the ways that fishery catch potential is moving around the oceans. And what is fishery catch potential? If you were to get out on a boat and go fishing, especially at the high seas, how much fish could you possibly catch? That's your catch potential. And what this shows is that the blue areas, in the mid and high latitudes especially, are places where catch potential is expected to go up. And in red, you see areas where catch potential is expected to go down. So this is really a global redistribution of catch potential for fisheries, and pairing that with biodiversity loss in some places, it poses risks for the sustained provision of fisheries from the oceans. And this graphic turns to risks for food production and associated implications for food security on land. And for this one, I'll give a call out to Professor David Lobel, who worked with colleagues in developing this. In this case, it might have been the longest it's ever taken David to produce a figure. Several years, several thousand review comments later, we have a masterpiece. And what it really shows are the impacts projected for crop yields through the coming century. So little stacked bars that are blue show projections where increases in yields are projected. The orange bars show projected decreases in yield. And what you see here is that by the 2030s, about 10% of projections show increases of greater than 10%, but 25% or 10% of projections also show decreases of greater than 25%. So those are really substantial increases really in the near term. And as you move through the century, the risks for food production go higher with increasing magnitudes of warming. There are a few different ways that the assessment cuts across all of the different risks assessed in the 2,000 pages of the report. And one of them is through assessment of regional key risks, really considering how risks are changing through the coming century. So key risks are risks where the hazard is really high, or vulnerability is high, or exposure is high, creating risks that are particularly relevant for thinking about what dangerous climate change might be, what central concerns are for different regions. And what this quite small little series of bars up here shows is that risk levels were assessed at the present time, with the total risk extending out here, and that little gray portion indicating where we know we're not as prepared for the current climate as we might be, where if we were smart about adapting even in the present world, we could be better prepared for the risks we see. Moving to the near term, this time frame where warming is baked into the climate system, again, risk levels and potential for adaptation was assessed. And moving to the end of the century, that kind of longer term era of climate options, risk levels were assessed for 2C, above pre-industrial, that's basically a scenario of ambitious mitigation, and 4C, more like continued high emissions. And all of the regions of the world were assessed, looking at risks across them. There are a lot of commonalities here in terms of risks for food insecurity, water scarcity and drought, health, well-being, ecosystems, and extremes. And then Further, putting all of these pieces together, the grand finale in the Working Group 2 assessment is really the assessment of 5 different reasons for concern. The reasons for concern date back to the 3rd assessment report in the IPCC, where Professor Steve Schneider really founded this framework, and it's been carried to the present day. On the right-hand side of this plot, you see these 5 reasons for concern, where each of those burning embers corresponds to 1 reason for concern. So why are these important? What they really show is that there's no one way to think about the risks of climate change. Depending on what you value, you might find different metrics more important than others, and you may use them differently in deciding what is danger in the context of climate change. So what are these reasons for concern? The first one is risks for unique and threatened systems. These are systems that might not extend very far geographically, but they are really important in terms of supporting unique ecosystems and cultures. They're things like coral reefs, Arctic sea ice systems. The second reason for concern is risks associated with extreme weather events, so whether that's extremes of heat, heavy rain, coastal flooding. The third one is risks associated with the distribution of impacts. So climate change does not affect everyone equally. The risks are unevenly distributed, and this ember really boils down looking at risks for particularly affected people, whether it's food security or water insecurity, and saying, how do those risks differ for these disproportionately affected people? The fourth ember looks at global aggregate impacts. These are things you can tally at a global scale, whether it's risks for the overall global economy or risks for Earth's biodiversity. And then the final ember here is risks associated with large-scale singular events. What does that mean? These are risks for abrupt and irreversible changes for a whole bunch of different types of systems, whether it's coral reefs bleaching and no longer supporting biodiversity, or whether it's ice sheet collapse, and which carries large consequences for sea level rise. Some of these risks play out over very long timeframes. The left side of the screen here shows those plumes. This is the warming to date, this is continued high emissions, and this is a scenario of ambitious mitigation, and what the warming could be through the coming century to provide context for understanding these risk levels. And so basically, for some of these reasons for concern, climate change has already increased the risks we see. For others, as we head to 1 or 2 degrees C of additional warming, risks of severe and widespread impacts will go up. And that there are others that at 3 or 4 degrees C additional warming, the risks become very high. So building from this assessment of risks, the report considers many different ways to respond to climate change. And although it might seem like responding to climate change has to be really expensive or be an all-consuming exercise that we all leave this room and start responding to climate change, what the report really shows is that smart responses can help build a world that is richer, more resilient, more secure. And in this final slide, I'm going to walk through a whole bunch of different entry points for responding to climate change. So this is this figure that Mike started with, showing these different determinants of risks, the physical hazard, vulnerability, exposure, with climate and society impinging on those risks and affecting them. And then stepping through the different parts here, I'll consider some of the different entry points for reducing risks responding to climate change. The first one is mitigation, addressing the root of the problem, reducing emissions of heat-trapping gases. Second, there are a bunch of different ways to reduce vulnerability and exposure through societal responses that really help reduce that threat multiplier effect. So you can reduce vulnerability and exposure through better land planning, through basic public health measures, through reducing poverty. There are also many actions that are considered low regrets, in that we know they would make us better prepared for the current climate, and that they would also help increase preparedness across a bunch of different climate futures. And finally, although the risks of climate change have to have climate change in there, what Mike hit at the start of this presentation is that there are many things that have nothing to do with climate really, but that nonetheless increase the risk of climate change. So addressing these factors, for example, the inequalities associated with socioeconomic status or ethnicity, can be ways to reduce vulnerability and exposure and reduce risks. As I touched upon earlier, you can directly assess the widest possible range of risks and then monitor and learn over time as you implement responses to reduce risks of climate change, respond to them smartly. And as part of risk management, it's important to recognize that behavior, values, worldviews, goals are really important for thinking about how people perceive risks in the first place and whether or not and how they act upon them. Those values and goals are important more broadly in thinking about the entire trajectories of society and development over time. And the report considers in particular climate resilient pathways, ways to achieve sustainable development through iteratively combining adaptation and mitigation. The report also looks at different types of adaptation. Incremental adaptation could be thought of as adaptation baby steps, taking small steps to being more prepared for the impacts of climate change, as compared to transformational adaptation, big jumps, big leaps towards greater preparedness. So if you were to take a specific example, if you change the date at which you plant your crops, that would be an incremental adjustment. If you change where you grow your crop in the first place, that would be a transformational adjustment. The report looks at many different objectives together, adaptation and mitigation, and finds many different places where you can find synergies between different types of responses, recognizing that adaptation fundamentally has to recognize context, the particularities that lead to vulnerability and exposure, and the specific hazards in given places to be effective. And that adaptation is something that really is done by many people around the world, whether it's families, communities, local governments, national governments, and especially the private sector and security. And in terms of that single big take-home, it's really that climate change is a challenge of managing risks. Responding to climate change is very much about making decisions in a changing world with persistent uncertainties and also big potential for learning over time. And so in putting together all of these pieces, you can see that responding to climate change can be a way to help build a world that is more vibrant. And with that, all three of us would be happy to take questions.